gun sales fall 20% in June, plus crime analyst Jeff Asher on the recent decline in the murder rate. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter right now if you want to keep up with what's going on with guns in America. This week, we are talking about the murder rate and signs that it may be declining. And to do that, we're having a crime data analyst on. Jeff Asher from Datalytics is on with us today. How are you doing, Jeff?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show. Can you tell people a little bit more about yourself and your background, just for anybody who doesn't know you yet?
Yeah, data analyst based in New Orleans. I have a company, as you mentioned, Datalytics. We do data consulting for a host of organizations throughout the public sector with a emphasis on law enforcement. So working with police departments, working with prosecutor offices, but basically any organization that needs a little bit of data help and wants the analytics or wants the ability to analyze their data and understand it in an easier way. We're hoping that they call us. So that's generally what we do.
Nice. And you have a background doing this sort of work before you went out into the private sector, right?
Yeah, I was with New Orleans Police Department for a couple of years. I'm a native New Orleanian. Before that, I was with the federal government for 7 years doing data analysis. And so I got to writing and realized that back home, nobody was doing this type of work. And then as I sort of started to branch out on my own, realized that nobody was really writing towards crime data that's not doing it with some sort of prior bias and, very non-emotional stance. So, and, in general, if you can string two sentences together, you're sort of ahead of the pack, I've found. So that's where I started to do analysis.
Yeah, and you've written for a number of major publications like The Atlantic and CNN and several others as well. But you also have your own Substack that you write where you focus on data analytics, and you have just published a piece recently on the murder rate at the mid-year. Here, we wrote about it over at The Reload because what you found was pretty interesting. What is the situation looking like now halfway through 2023?
So there's 18,000 law enforcement agencies nationwide, and they all report data in different formats. Some don't report at all. They report data, some publicly on their websites. Most report it to the FBI. And so what we found is that if you get a collection of agencies, a sample of, generally 25, 50, 75, or 100 of the largest agencies, you can kind of predict what the national trend is and what is happening nationwide. And even through this point in mid-July right now, it's generally predictive of where we're going to be at the end of the year. Something like 2020 can happen and you're, as the months go on, you're seeing the change. But generally in normal years, if you have enough cities of data and you've got late enough in the year, you can predict what's going to happen when the FBI data comes out. The FBI is not going to release their data until, for 2023, until 9 or 10 months after the fact. So we're not going to have 2023 data until September, October of 2024. So using a sample, we're able to accurately understand the trend without seeing it precisely. And so what we have is we have 104 cities right now. We added our 104th city today. And the data for those cities shows about an 11% decline this year relative to last year. If you historically look at the data, you can see that big cities tend to overstate the national trend. So if murder is up 6% in big cities, you would expect maybe murder's up 3% nationally. If it's down 8% in big cities, you'd expect maybe it's down 5 or 6% nationally. And so if it's down 11% in our big city sample, that is suggestive of somewhere in the 8 to 10% range decline nationally, which it doesn't sound that impressive, but murder tends to go up or down by a couple of percentage points.
Right. So
2020
10% would be a pretty tremendous change.
It would be the largest change ever recorded. The largest previous percent decline would be 9% in 1996. And it would also, if we have a double-digit decline in murder this year, it would be the first time that we ever had 2,000 fewer murders from one year to the next. So it's not just that we have fewer murders now, it's that we're having a substantial decline in murder. Even if it doesn't exceed 1996, it's still a substantial decline after what was in 2020, the largest one-year increase ever recorded.
Wow. Yeah, so that's pretty remarkable what you're finding at this point in time. It's certainly not an insignificant change. You're talking about a really substantial downturn in murder in the United States from what we're seeing in the sample so far.
Yeah, and it's the third quarter. I mean, we're not talking about it being, running out the clock and being in victory formation or anything like that. So things could still change. We do have a big city sample, and so it's possible that our big city sample is more overstating than typical the national trend, but it looks like we're going to see a decline no matter what. A large decline is most likely in the cards. But I should note that even a 10% decline this year would still leave us 30 or so percent above 2014's low. It would still leave us substantially above 2019 before we had the 2020 surge. And so we're still talking about way too many murders in America. And we're also seeing places like Cleveland, DC, Memphis, Kansas City, where the national trend is seeing a decline, but these cities are seeing, in some cases, big increases. And so it's yes, nationally we're seeing a decline, but it's 2/3 or 70% of our sample. It's not every city. And I think that those are important caveats to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's not an across the board decline necessarily. So how does that even out? Are you seeing major declines in some cities? Are you seeing declines in most cities? And then there's a couple outliers like DC and the other cities you mentioned. How does it break out in the data?
So in most cities, I think only 31 of the 104 cities are having an increase this year so far. There have been pretty substantial declines in a number of places. New Orleans, where I am, murder's down 20%. And that comes after last year, where New Orleans had the highest murder rate the city had achieved since before Katrina. Buffalo, New York, murder's down 60%. There were 42 murders in Buffalo, including the horrendous mass shooting in the supermarket in 2022 through June. This year, they're at 16. Chicago has seen a steady 10% decline. And if you include that on top of last year, where Chicago also saw a 10% decline, it's a 20% two-year decline, which is pretty significant for Chicago. New York, murders down 10%, but shootings are down 25%. Philadelphia, murders down, I think, close to 30%. Jackson, Mississippi, which also had probably the highest murder rate of any city, over 150,000 last year, is seeing a big decline. Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which also saw a big increase. Minneapolis, Milwaukee, all seeing big decreases. So in any sample where you're seeing, you're not going to see uniform declines. Even in 2020, only 80% of our sample, big city sample, saw an increase. So there were still 20% of our sample that had a decrease in murder, despite the historic increase in 2020. There are a lot more examples of cities that are seeing big decreases than are cities that are seeing big increases.
Okay, interesting. So, and that's pretty typical, like you said. It's not you don't expect every city to have a matching decline or matching increase when you're looking year to year, unless there's something particularly abnormal going on, right?
Right, and the Great Crime Decline, which began in '92 and went for 6 years of, I think, 40% decrease nationally over 6 years. Nationally, it was a huge decline. In New Orleans, it didn't begin until 1995. New Orleans had in 94 over 400 murders for a city of 500,000. It was the worst year in terms of murder rate for any city that had at that point ever been recorded in the U.S. And so for New Orleans to have its worst murder rate 3 years into the great crime decline, I think is a good example of the fact that we should not expect uniform across the board, because it's not just one thing that's leading to the decline. It's not just one factor. And in different places, they're going to feel things differently. And so that's going to lead to different trends.
Good. Yeah. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about sort of the historical gun murder, just murder rate in the United States and what we've seen the last 3 years and where things may be headed. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the methodology here and maybe just sort of your view on how well we're doing right now about tracking murder and gun and just crime generally, given sort of the FBI's switch over in methodology for how they're collecting data. We talked about this on a previous podcast that I encourage people to listen to. But first, let's talk about your specific model. You gave us a little bit of insight into it earlier, and then I want to talk about what's going on with the FBI. But so you have 104 cities, basically police departments that you're taking data from. How does that process work? Because they're not sending it to you. It's not like the FBI where the FBI is requesting data from every police agency basically in the country and they send it in. It's voluntary, but it has historically had a pretty high rate of compliance. How does your organization actually go through and collect this data?
We do it the hard way. We go through manually, and once a week we click on. If you go to our website ahdatalytics.com, you can go to the year-to-date murder dashboard. There's a link that sends you to every source, and so probably 99 or 100 of the 104 agencies are coming from the agency themselves or from the major chiefs of police, where they put out a report every quarter. So we've got about 15 agencies that we're using their data. But
so it's official data from the police departments.
Yeah, it's just slow. So we only have data through the first quarter for those agencies. The issue with our methodology is that we have some cities that produce data daily. We have Washington, D.C., Kansas City, New Orleans, St. Louis. They produce daily data on their murder numbers. Other cities do it weekly. Philadelphia puts out a great report every week. Chicago, New York does the same thing. Some agencies do it monthly, and they report the data reasonably quickly within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the next month. Some agencies do it quarterly. Some agencies do it monthly, but San Bernardino, California is a good one. They've only got data through February. They do it monthly, but they haven't published any data since February. Newark is another one, has not published since April. So it's very frustrating to see a lot of these agencies that there's no standard practice for how often to publish. There's no standard practice for how to publish. DC, you click the button, it goes to the website. They show you the number of murders this year. They show you the number of murders last year. Other places you get a PDF. Some places like Memphis, because Memphis is such an important city because of what's happening there to have in our sample, we have to download their homicide data from, they provide it on an incident basis. So we download the data and compare how many incidents this year versus how many incidents last year. So it can be a little bit challenging with some agencies. It makes for some places that we've got a lot of confidence in, and some places where I really wish that I had data that was more up to date, and we just don't. And that's the best system. If there was a better system, we would use it. If we could scrape the data from every agency, we would do that. But agencies frequently aren't using the same addresses. They aren't using the same methodology. I'm not the most technical person in the world. I'm not sure how to scrape a PDF that's published monthly on a different, with a different web address each month. So it can be very challenging, and the only solution is just sort of brute force it every month or every week.
Yeah, so it's a very time intensive process, it sounds like, and but it is coming from official sources, which is a little bit different, I guess, to the other one of the other measures that's out there. It's not the FBI. Before we get to them, there's Gun Violence Archive, which you did talk about in your piece, and we've interviewed the head of Gun Violence Archive before. You know, they're most famous for their mass shooting counter that gets a lot of attention in media, but they track all kinds of different incidents, or they try to, but they basically their methodology is to use reports, like like from the media, to track things, right? That's one distinction between the two of you.
Yeah, and they're doing everywhere, and they're doing an aggregated count. I think that they are a wonderful source of information. We know exactly how many people were shot in Philadelphia this year because Philadelphia's police department has put that data out there. So we can compare their data to Gun Violence Archive, how many people they say have been shot in Philadelphia, and we will see a difference. And so their methodology I find to be inaccurate or imprecise, but generally accurate. Right. So if you compare their trend with Philadelphia's trend, the numbers won't be the same, but the trends will be the same. Right. And so I find them to be a good sort of additional means of showing that our sample is not crazy, that this is actually what's happening nationwide.
Yeah, I think the main critique for them, and again, we have a whole podcast where we get into these discussions with the founder of GVA, but is more about their definitions of things like mass shootings rather than their actual data that they've collected. But you also said in your piece that their numbers give further credence to your analysis for this mid-year estimate on I keep adding gun in there, just murder rates for where the murder rate is. The gun murder rate is a slightly different statistic than the murder rate, not something that you guys have tracked, right? But no,
and we sort of assume that non-gun murders are kind of stable. They've been generally stable for the last years, decades in the U.S., and it's really been changes in shootings that has been what's driven the U.S. murder rate. So, sure. You can compare their data and their collection to the national trend and see the same thing. It's not as reliable, I think, we know that the big city sample overstates the national trend. I know that. I can show that year after year for the last 2.5 decades. With the Gun Violence Archive, it's sort of up or down from the national trend. It's usually within about 3% as well, but there's no predictable way of knowing whether or not it's up or down from the national trend. And so, and then some years it's been very close. Some years it's been off by 5 or 6%. So it's hard to say, other than that both of these metrics are pointing in the same direction, which hopefully gives some confidence that direction is accurate.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing there. I mean, certainly the Gun Violence Archive, one critique of their methodology is just that they're relying on media reports, which are not going to cover everything. This is sort of much more relevant to things like defensive gun use than it is to murder, because murder is much more likely to get covered in local media than a defensive gun use situation where no shots are fired, or maybe the police aren't even informed of it. But that's obviously a completely separate situation, which we had with the head of Gun Violence Archive, and people can listen to. But the important bit is that you've got these two substantially different methodologies, but they're both showing the same thing, which is a decline in murder through the first 6 months of 2023. Now, you mentioned earlier the FBI, and we'll get maybe a more complete picture of what's going on once their numbers come out. But of course, that won't be for a year and a half, I guess, or maybe a little bit less than a year and a half. Like, we don't have 2022 numbers from the FBI yet, right? So we're gonna have to wait a while before we see the FBI's numbers. But I do want to talk and get your view on their methodology issues, because somewhat unfortunately, the FBI has decided to switch to a new system for reporting crime data right as the murder spike was happening, right? They changed how they're bringing in numbers from police departments. And unfortunately, when you do that, even if the new system is better, when this is a voluntary program, you're going to have a lot of police departments a lot of government institutions that just aren't going to follow over, at least not right away. And that's basically what we've seen, right? They've lost a lot of a lot of departments reporting to them, correct?
So they did. They did in 2021. Only about 65% of the U.S. population was covered by an agency that reported to NIBRS, and only about 52% of the U.S. population was covered by an agency that reported 12 months of data to NIBRS. Like, right. Chicago Police Department reported only 7 months of data to NIBRS because they weren't NIBRS compliant for the first 5 months of the year.
And that's the new system. That's the acronym.
Right. There is good news, though, and I don't know why the FBI hasn't been talking about this publicly, but they are going to, in 2022, allow agencies to report the old way as well. So it used to be back in 2019, 2020, it was kind of an even split, maybe 55-45, as far as agencies reporting via NIBRS and agencies reporting via the summary reporting system, which is the system that's been in use for 90-something years. So for 2022, they're going to allow agencies that did not make the transition to NIBRS to submit their crime data so that it can be included in the estimates. So in theory, this should make the estimates much stronger for 2022 and beyond. And again, it's something that we don't know exactly how much of an impact this is going to have. It's something that I've been told several times by the FBI, but they haven't talked about sort of this implementation. So is it plausible that agencies will report 2022 data and we'll do it at the same level? Yeah. Is it possible that some agencies that just didn't make the NIBRS transition and have just decided not to report data at all, even though they can? It's also possible for that. So it's hard to say exactly what that number would be, but in theory, the estimates for 2022 and beyond will be much stronger than they were in 2021, which it'll be an asterisk forever.
Yeah, because they lost like 5,000 police departments, if you look at least what they're saying on their website for their estimates in 2021. So does that mean they're just going to have like one bad year? 2021 is just going to be a year where they had really bad numbers, and then it goes back to having 80+% compliant, 80+% of the country covered by these reports.
Yeah, it looks that way. And it used to be 95 to 97% of agencies would report under the old system. So
fascinating.
It does look like there's going to be a much better report in 2022. But don't hold me to that. Don't call me back on here.
I'll hold the FBI to that. It'll be their responsibility. Don't worry. But because that'd be nice, because that's one of the things that's gone on is like, just as we're, because we had decades there. I know that the murder spike sort of started before 2020. There was an increase that was happening. You alluded to like 2014 being a low point before, but obviously 2020 was a big outlier, and this huge increase in murder throughout the country. And yet it continued on. It has continued on. And obviously it's harder to track that stuff when the FBI's numbers aren't reliable. And so it's just like this terrible timing that they went through where they're like, all right, we're going to try to force everyone into this new system right as, crime data was becoming much more relevant to everyday life, and much more attention was being paid to it. So hopefully as you're saying here, we'll get better numbers coming down the line.
Yeah, it is a shame. I think if you talk to them, they'll say that it was sort of a necessary evil to just sort of give agencies a kick in the pants to start to report via the new system. Whether or not that's actually true, there's no way to know for sure, but hopefully it is moving on from the problematic stage to the being solved stage.
Yeah. So let's talk about these historic trends, right? So you mentioned there this crime drop that we saw in the 90s, right? And then that sustained for a very long time. We've been living through several decades of relatively low murder rate in the United States, for the United States, not necessarily compared to Western European countries or anything like that. But for the United States, the murder rate was much lower than it had been, and it had stayed low until we got to 2020, right? And then it jumped back up, and we were getting closer to those the bad days, the good bad, the bad old days of high murder rates. And it hasn't been clear whether this was going to be a brief spike. Things would go back down to where they had been in the 2000s and 2010s, or if this was going to become a new normal in America, where we were seeing really unacceptable murder rates like we used to. So can you just give us some insight into, what the general thought has been on? To me, I'd never really seen a great explanation for why the murder rate dipped and stayed low for that time period. There's a lot of politically motivated reasonings out there, obviously, and I haven't seen a great explanation for our current environment either, or why it should go one way or the other. Do you have thoughts on maybe just starting with that crime drop in the 90s and how the country was able to sustain that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say with certainty. And I think that generally it's complicated is the best answer. I know it's like the least satisfying answer to give in an environment like this. But
well, as long as it's the true answer, that's what we want.
Right. I think anybody selling you it was X or it was Y is sort of selling you a bill of goods and is not being reflective of the complexity of the situation. I think that in the 90s or the late 90s, early 2000s, strong economic conditions, there was a big surge in policing in the early and mid 90s. The crime bill. I think that there was you sort of saw a leveling off of arrests. They didn't continue to go up nationally, and for a lot of offenses that maybe drove mass incarceration, drove issues like that. It's the level of the crack boom. I don't know exactly how you would describe it, but that era sort of faded and went away. So I think that, and then also the other thing, there's a sociologist at, where is he now? Princeton, maybe, Patrick Sharkey, who talks about this sort of boon in investment in social programs, and that for every $1 million or $2 million or $3 million that were spent on social programs targeting people that were engaged in behaviors that might lead to gun violence, led to a 1 or 2% decline in murder rate in a city. And so you had all of these things, these policing and non-policing elements that sort of came together. And I think that all of them coming together sort of weaves the tale of how murder tended to go down. I don't think that we can necessarily point to exactly what the recipe was, but I think that all of those things make sense as drivers. Very similarly, in 2020, we can kind of point to what a few of the explanations that make the most sense are, and each person is going to be different. And I think the same caveat holds, that anybody telling you that it's X or it's Y is giving way too much confidence to the explanation, because 80% of cities saw an increase. 80% of cities did not see giant increases in protests. 80% of cities did not see waves of police resignations and depolicing. So what the actual explanation was is to explain such a national increase, I think you have to look toward the national trends. And so we know, so we have to sort of go through the chronology of 2020. Murder was up. It was up about 7% through the first quarter, through sort of April, early May. And we can see that from the FBI's supplementary homicide report data. So we know that murder was up.
That's the onset of the pandemic period, right?
That's the onset of the pandemic. So it's
before
not
the riot,
pandemic
before
did
the
not
protests
cause
and
the
riots
surge.
and stuff. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't the pandemic happened and then murder went up in the US. That clearly did not happen. In May, June, July, August of 2020, there was this big surge in gun violence. It was guns. It was, the number of firearms, or the share of murders that were committed via firearm in 2020 was up over 70%. And that was by far the largest percentage ever recorded. That figure has been sort of going up steadily, but it went up a lot in 2020. And using the FBI data, we can see that sort of non-firearm murders were generally steady year on year. Firearm murders went up big. As far as how to explain it, I point to the sort of the depolicing and the loss of police legitimacy, loss of police trust after the murder of George Floyd, all of the protests. I think that those are symptoms of the same disease. If you've read Ghetto-Side by Jill Leovy, it's a terrific book. It's all about murder in Los Angeles, but I think it speaks to the importance of what she calls the monopoly of state violence, so that the police are the ones that are the only ones that can make arrests, that can solve murders, that can basically delve out justice for killings that have happened. And in the absence of that, in the absence of trust that the police are going to do that, then you're going to see this sort of cycle of violence that is very difficult to interrupt. So you've got retribution killings, you've got lots of arguments, lots of sort of drug deals gone bad. Everybody's in a sort of a weird place mentally after the pandemic. And so you get this environment where you've also seen this pullback in policing in a lot of places. And it's hard to say causally whether it was this sort of loss of trust or whether it was this sort of loss of policing happening. But they're definitely both happening at the same time. And the question is, are they causally linked, or are police pulling back because the people are protesting? And so these things are just sort of happening at the same time. And then the other factor that I think is important is that, as you've noted, there was this big surge in firearm sales that predated the George Floyd. It started in the early 2020. And so we had this big surge in firearm sales. And what we see in, I did a piece on this with Rob Arthur in, I think, Vox. But if you look at, we took data on arrests and stops in 10 cities that had data. And starting in March, April, the share of stops and arrests where a firearm is found it skyrockets in all of these places. And so the implication here is that either one, police suddenly got really good at figuring out which car had a firearm in it, or two, with the firearm sales, there was a big increase in the share of people that were carrying firearms. And so I think that you could build the argument, not that firearms are a cause here. It's not that, again, we didn't see a surge in firearm sales and then all of a sudden we saw a surge in violence, but that the surge in people carrying firearms meant that a lot of situations that maybe previously would not have had a firearm involved, suddenly this argument has a firearm involved because a lot more people are carrying firearms during the pandemic. So that's my way of conceptually putting it together, but I don't have a lot of data there. I've got a lot of individual pieces that I think make sense to me. I don't know that that's necessarily the answer, though.
Right. And I do think there's a couple of critiques I would have of the last bit, at least, because I do agree with you that there's a lot of probably nuance in what's happening here. And it's not just one factor that played a role in the murder spike, right? It's probably the pandemic. There was also a lot of prisoner releases at the beginning of the pandemic that happened as well. Whether those prisoners went on, how many of them went on to commit murder, I think is not something that is known. And it may not be a major driver of what happened either, but that's another factor. Certainly, like you talked about, the police pullback. Although, if I remember correctly, the murder rate increased, like you mentioned, in places that weren't directly affected by protests or police resignations, and even happened in rural areas as well. It wasn't just city areas that saw this increase. So that sort of I'm sure that played a role, but probably not the only role, right? And the same thing with firearm sales, right? During that period of time that we talked about earlier, where we had this sustained low murder rate. We also saw a lot of increase in firearms sales during that period. And then also, during the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, huge spike in sales. The rioting saw another huge spike in sales. But while that meant there were a lot more people who own guns than before, probably a lot of new gun owners in that pool, the reason we know there was a spike in sales, right, is not because there's a national registry that tells you who all owns guns or how many are sold every year. It's because of background checks, right?
Right.
We count the background checks as an analog for gun sales, which means that the people who bought those guns could pass a background check. And I think it's unlikely that they were, that a substantial number of those people are who drove the spike. And even with that bit, because I remember reading actually that piece at the time, and it is interesting, but I think Robert Verbruggen, who we've had on the podcast before, over at NRO, wrote a response to that piece that I thought made more sense to me because, now I will say there was a slight increase in the number of guns that were recently sold showing up in ATF trace numbers, because most trace guns, most crime guns are 8 to 10 years old, right? The average I think is 8.9. It came down a little bit during the pandemic. So there probably was some amount of firearms being bought, an increase in the number of guns that were recently bought going and showing up at crime scenes. The trace data isn't specific to murders, but there's still probably gives you a little bit of a correlation there. But I will say, like, it probably had more to do with because people being stopped by the police and having guns found on them are, depending on what city you're in and the laws there, they're probably not people who could legally own guns anyway. And so what you probably saw was an increase in both your sort of law-abiding people wanting to buy guns because of all the chaos going on. And then also, criminals, frankly, their motivations for wanting guns and carrying guns are very similar to everyone else, right? Which is that they want to protect themselves. Now, a criminal carrying a gun on the street is probably trying to protect themselves from somebody else who's probably not allowed to legally have a gun on the street either. And it's probably saw an increase in both of those groups having guns on them, if that makes any sense. I mean, obviously it's not like criminal and non-criminal and people stay those roles forever. It's not that black and white, obviously, but I think generally speaking, Verbruggen's theory was both that non-criminals were buying guns for protection, and then also criminals tended to carry guns more often is perhaps what was going on. And that is part of what led to this increase in fatal shootings, involved in street crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would make a distinction there for my purposes. I think that you sort of mentioned the ATF data. It wasn't just a small increase. It went from in about 25 to 30% of traced firearms being within 2 years of purchase to almost half in 2021. So I guess
what I mean by small increase is just I don't. You're right. I don't want to mislead anyone. What I mean is, like, the overall number of the guns
most
they
guns
traced
are not
is a
being
relatively
found in a
small
crime.
number. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. And I think that the important thing to sort of keep in mind when looking at murder is that murder makes up 0.2% of all major crimes that are reported to the FBI each year. So it doesn't take a lot of incidents of, hey, you and I get into a fight in 2019 and neither of us are carrying a gun. 2021, we get into a fight and both of us are carrying guns, and it leads to a fatal incident that wouldn't have earlier occurred. You get a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand of those incidents, and you have a big change in the number of murders. So it doesn't take a lot for such a low base rate crime to see a large percentage change.
Yeah, and I do think that the basic theory that police were maybe not necessarily getting better at finding guns during traffic stops or whatever, and that were just more people carrying guns is probably true. It's just connecting that to the increase in people who can pass a background check buying a gun. That's where I think there's less of a direct connection is all. So I don't know that we're very far apart on this point, but that's my main critique for what I would say.
And it circles back to, if we had better data, we could point to, okay, we're also seeing this increase in stolen firearms, or there's a correlation between places that are having, increased stolen firearms with increased shootings. But because we don't have enough good, NIBRS could actually produce that data. But it's not produced at a level that allows us to do that. So we're SOL on that one.
So where do you see things headed from here now that we've seen obviously you cautioned earlier that just because there's been a decrease in the first 6 months doesn't mean that we're going to end up at the same point by the end of the year. I think the big question is, was the murder spike just a spike, just a momentary abnormality? Are we headed back to the levels we were at before 2020, or are we going to see a new normal, basically, with much more violence in the United States than we had seen the past 20 years?
That's a good question. You might as well be asking to predict who's going to win the next 3 Super Bowls. It's I think really hard to say. I don't think anything about the spike in 2020 and 2021 was inevitable. And I don't think anything about the decline in 2022 and now 2023 bigger is inevitable. And so I think that it is hard to say exactly how far down we'll go. If you told me, reported from the 2025 and said that we sort of stayed at this level and this was the new normal, I would say, yeah, that's okay. That makes sense. Or if you told me that we're continuing to decline to, 2014 numbers, I would say, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that you could probably create a scenario where either thing happens. There are lots of places that, like Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, where not only are we seeing a decline, but we're seeing an accelerating decline. And so we're not sort of coming into a plateau. We're continuing to see a decline. But there are enough places that sort of give you pause. One of the things I did is I took Gun Violence Archive data and I split Mississippi shootings between Jackson, Mississippi, and the rest of the state. And the rest of the state is seeing an increase. Jackson is seeing an accelerating decline in shootings. So I think that we need to better understand if this is just big cities that had a big increase that are seeing a big decline this year, or is it the same broadness that we had in 2020, that broad increase? Are we seeing just the reverse of that, maybe a little less intense? Ideally, we want it to be the broad decrease everywhere, but we can barely describe the big city trend. Explaining it more, I think, is really difficult right now.
Okay. And so just a final question here. What are the cities you're going to be watching closest for, to give us a sign of where this is headed?
So I had a New York Times piece probably 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that there's 4 cities that are predictive of the national trend. So if you just had, I think it's Chicago, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and either New York, or I think it might be Philadelphia is the 4th city. And I'll have to relook at the piece, but basically there's a handful of cities that you can use that can sort of be predictive of the national trend. All 4 of those cities are seeing declines: Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So if that continues or it accelerates, then we'll probably feel pretty good that we've seen a pretty good national decline. If they sort of revert to the mean and they're, those 4 cities, they're down, but they're not down huge, then maybe we'll say that it was sort of a more of a one-time decline that looked really good for the first half of 2023, but couldn't be sustained going forward. So I think those are the types of places that I look. And then the cities that are seeing big increases: Memphis, Cleveland, Kansas City, DC. why, how can we understand why these are outliers? Is there an explanation? I think Memphis is easier to explain than the other places, but it behooves us to better understand why they're not only are they not going down, they're going up significantly. And so I think that the better we can understand that, the better we can understand what's causing the decline.
Do you have a short, just reason for why you think Memphis is special?
Well, you look at all of these cases of going back to police legitimacy after Tyree Nichols was killed. That's when Memphis was seeing a decline, and then all of a sudden started to see an increase. And so I really do think it's this combination of people who didn't already trust the police are having less trust in the police to act as an arbiter. And there's probably been some degree of depolicing as Memphis Police Department has come under pretty intense criticism. And so I think a combination of those, everything that happened nationwide in 2020 is happening again in Memphis would be the best explanation. But again, it's only been 6 months. So we need a lot more time and a lot more data to be able to say that with a lot more confidence.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back on maybe
I look
at
forward
the end
to
of the
it.
year and see where things ended up. But hopefully they'll continue in this path because it's obviously good news, which is fairly rare. The last couple of years. So I'm glad to hear it. If people want to read more of what you've written or follow you, where can they do that?
I'm at jasher.substack.com. And I'm also on Twitter at Crimealytics. It's mostly just dog pictures at this point, but occasionally there's insightful nuggets in there. And then if people are interested, agedatalytics.com. If you click on our dashboards button, you can find our year-to-date murder calculator, and that shows a comparison. It's got a couple other data points and sort of puts the change in context and hopefully is a useful source for people.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to head over to our news update now.
Thanks for having me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing all right. Jake, how are you?
Doing pretty good. Can't complain.
Awesome. I'm actually getting ready to head up to Pennsylvania to go to the farm this weekend and do my annual charity range day. That I'm actually somewhat hilariously comes from a celebrity auction that I'm involved with for a group called Homes for Our Troops that Jake Tapper over at CNN runs. And he runs the auction, not the whole charity. But we do this every year. Somebody pays for a range day. They're usually very generous, and so I try to show them a really good time. And so I'm getting ready to head up there and do some shooting. It should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Get to spend a day out on the range, and it's for a good cause, it sounds like. So that sounds like a pretty cool deal. Yeah,
it's wonderful too up there on the farm, and one of my parents' friends lets us use their range. Merrill Walters, he's actually a Reload member, great guy, real patriot. So he helps out with the range day, and we get to shoot his Texas Star and some of the other fun little elements that he has, and I think it's going to be a great time.
That's outstanding. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
And I'll keep everybody updated on that. I'll put some pictures in the members newsletter and stuff, and keep people updated on how it went.
All right. And then as we're getting into the news of the week, we'll start with some of the headlines from the newsletter. First comes from The Trace, and we have a report that from early provisional CDC data, gun deaths appear to have gone down slightly in 2022 after being elevated in 2020 and 2021.
It's good news.
It is good news. We also have from Mass Live some news about the Massachusetts Democrats' big gun control push, their Bruin response bill that also includes, hardware bans and ghost gun bans. And it's basically an omnibus, everything bagel gun control bill. And there's some procedural disputes happening right now that potentially threatens that bill passing. Yeah,
that'll be one that we're going to watch closely because it's somehow it's actually much more expansive than the other Bruin response bills. So it'd be pretty fascinating to see what Massachusetts actually ends up doing there.
And then getting into some of the news that we reported this week, you actually had a huge piece talking to several experts, legal experts in the Second Amendment space about what they're expecting to see from the upcoming Rahimi case that we talked about last week, now that the Supreme Court is going to hear its next gun case.
Yeah, I talked to experts from across the sort of ideological spectrum, and they were all pretty unsure about exactly how this is going to come out. I think that's unique to Bruin. I mean, there were some experts are always, they're always kind of wary to give you a definitive answer, because I guess it's the classic: the more you know about something, the more you understand how much you don't know. But regardless, they did have a few areas of agreement that I think are pretty fascinating. It's a good long piece that has a lot of direct quotes from these guys. And then of course we actually had for the members, there was one area where a couple of these experts said this law that's being challenged, this domestic violence restraining order gun ban, has a particularly weak point to it. And I think that could come into play. Mark Smith talked about it last week on the podcast. Actually, he's one of the people quoted, but even though, and I actually think Mark got this mixed up, but even though Rahimi meets both of the requirements, there was a specific claim that he was dangerous, a specific accusation that he had, assaulted the mother of his child. There is another kind of domestic violence restraining order that doesn't even require that level of, accusation to exist. And both, of course, have significant due process questions because they're civil proceedings instead of criminal ones. But that's, I think, a particularly interesting bit. That's something that could be a potential Achilles heel that, I wrote about with some quotes from those experts for the members.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and members should go over and take a look and read that to get the scoop. But that takes us to our main story that we want to talk about this week, because we have some new data on gun sales for the last month, the month of June. And it appears that they are down pretty significantly from last year over year, something like 20%. Is that right? Yeah, huge drop off. We haven't really been talking a lot about gun sales in recent months because honestly, they've been fairly stable. They've been declining since 2020, which is what you'd expect, right? It's not surprising because 2020 was this sort of perfect storm in terms of motivating people to buy guns, all the chaos that was happening from the pandemic to the riots to, the election. There was just a lot going on that might make somebody want to go out and buy a gun for self-defense or because they were afraid new gun laws could come into existence, and you'd expect that from that point, you're going to have a decline. But we've been looking for sort of the new normal, the floor, ever since then. We wrote about this back in 2021 that, are we at this new floor? Because look, we've come down, but we seem to have leveled off a bit. And now it's pretty clear that we haven't really completely leveled off in terms of gun sales in the United States. So, where are we going to level off? I guess would be the big question. And what are the implications of that for not just the gun industry, but the gun rights movement too? It's something that I wrote about as well for, actually not for members this week. That one is public. Usually our analysis pieces, right, are member exclusives. But this week, my analysis of the gun sales situation, that's free for everyone. So anyone who wants to get a taste of what our analysis is like should check that out. Yeah, I agree. They should check it out because I think you raised a couple of good points. Particularly, we talked about, yes, they have leveled off. They're down something like 20% from last June and 50% from 2020's June, which obviously was the record month because of when it happened to land during the midst of the COVID pandemic, the George Floyd protests, and obviously the election was a few months away, but still that was on people's minds. But there are some factors that you pointed out in that piece that perhaps maybe could counteract some of this downside that we're seeing. Because it's worth pointing out that though we are down, gun sales are down, they're still pretty high, right? There's still over 1 million sales in a month, and there's been a huge streak of 1 million plus gun background
47
checks.
Months. Yeah,
right.
Which is impressive.
And we're heading into primary season when you pointed out that the current president, Joe Biden, is made gun control a central tenet of his presidency, and there's no expectation that he's going to stop heading into the primary. So as that heats back up, do we see the spike come back? There's just a lot of factors to consider.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's correct. But to me, that's also one of the things that makes it interesting that there was still a decline, right? Because Joe Biden is currently the president, right? He's not running to be president anymore. He is president, and he's not only been a very vocal advocate for new gun bans, but also has tried to implement them unilaterally through rulemaking. Right now, he's run into a lot of problems doing that, as we've covered on the show. But you'd think that would still keep the gun sales levels from slipping further. Now, again, you're right; they're still historically high. You're still like 30% up from where you were in 2019. So it's not like the industry is facing a recession by any means. But the fact that you had a 20% drop off from June 2022 to June 2023, that's a pretty big decline. That should raise some eyebrows, I think. And, it really raises the question, like, where is the actual floor going to be? Now, we are in an off year, unlike 2022. So there's no election this year. There was an election last year. June 2022 also saw, a new gun control bill actually pass in Congress, right? And it was also the month right before the assault weapons ban passed the House. Obviously, that didn't make it into law, but there's still a lot more attention on the politics of guns at that point in time than there are right now, frankly. And so, that could also clue you into that June 2022 is actually a particularly good June for gun sales. And that might be one of the reasons why there was such a decline from last year to this year. But the trend is still there overall, because you look at the second quarter numbers, you're still seeing declines across the board. It's not as severe as 20%. I think it was 6.7%, but the trend is clear, and what's not clear is where it's going to settle out.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And your point about last year's being when the gun control bill passed is well taken. And you have to wonder if perhaps maybe people understand now that we have a split Congress and we have the Bruin test. Right? Yeah, I was going to say with the Bruin test, and they feel more comfortable in that their rights are secure, and they don't feel the same urge to go out and buy new guns because they don't think a ban is down the pike. But it is worth pointing out. I mean,
there's a lot of stability, which is not usually the both politically and economically and several other factors. Not that everything is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's better than it was certainly in 2020, right, or even 2021, and so that puts a damper to some degree, I would imagine, on gun sales. Although my last point on this, or actually you had, what were you going to say?
But yeah, I was just going to say that it's worth pointing out that in a piece I wrote for this week's newsletter that we are seeing places where folks are turning to new gun sales. Yeah. We have a new poll from Siena College polled all of New York residents basically and asked them how they were feeling about crime, whether they thought it was a concern. And overwhelmingly, New Yorkers reported being very concerned about crime. They said, I think 52% said they feared being a victim of crime out in public. And one of the things that they're doing to address this is going to purchase guns for self-defense. 12% of New Yorkers overall said that they went out and purchased a gun in the last year for self-defense. And 17% of New York City residents in particular, which I think is even more interesting just because of you don't really associate gun ownership with New York City very often. But 17% actually said that they actually went and purchased a gun in the last year because of crime.
Right. And that, I think, rolls into my final point, actually, which is that, this is a good basis to get to what I was going to talk about. So I appreciate you bringing it up. It's a very good point. New York is, especially New York City, is not where you expect to see a lot of gun owners because it's very difficult to buy a gun there. And it's only become more difficult since Bruin, ironically. And now I think down the line that'll probably get sorted out and changed around by the courts. But for now, it's certainly true. And but you are still seeing these new gun owners come into the market, new people buying guns. Even in a place like New York. And obviously we had a huge surge of that during the 2020 gun buying spree. And that's the other point, I think, of concern. Because, not only is there a Democratic president who's a very staunch gun control advocate, which should historically has juiced gun sales, right? You saw that during the Obama administration. Then you saw it lull during the Trump administration. People called it the Trump slump, right? And you'd think that Biden being in there, who actually rhetorically is much more aggressive on gun control than even Barack Obama was. So, there should be more incentive. And then you also throw in the fact that there's all these new gun owners. So your floor should naturally be higher than it was before that spike of millions of new people buying guns. And it is for now, right? I don't want to get too far out on a limb here, but it is for now. But the continued decline from those 2020 levels is fascinating to see and could have implications both for the industry and, as I mentioned earlier, broader political implications. Like, what are these new gun owners doing? Like, are they as engaged as the pre-2020 gun owners? Are they less inclined to, get into the hobby aspect of gun ownership and buy more guns? Or there's just not a large percentage doing that yet. Maybe it's hard to say, but it's something that certainly I think needs more scrutiny from the gun rights movement and the industry itself to really understand what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really interesting point. You're not really seeing them, at least, as you said, at least as of yet, reacting to some of the same trends that you'd expect from longer term gun owners that they have in the past. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lot that could be gone into that, and I discuss it all at length in that analysis piece. Perhaps again, like you mentioned, the Supreme Court stepping in with a landmark ruling in favor of gun rights is putting people at ease. Certainly could be, and it's not actually an election year in 2023 as much as the primaries are starting to percolate. That's not going to be till next year. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that, as well as all these other stories. So make sure you stick around and keep following The Reload. Subscribe to our newsletter, buy a membership. That helps us a lot. And in fact, if you do buy a membership, you may get to appear on the podcast like we have upcoming right now in a member segment. Okay, it's time for one of my favorite segments, the members segment. This week we have a member from Illinois, Brad, with us on the show. How are you doing, Brad?
Stephen, I'm doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for coming on the show again. We've got, I think, 2 weeks in a row now, member segment. I like to do them. I'd do them every week, honestly, if members wanted to come on, because it's one of my favorite segments to do, just because it's nice to meet some of you guys who are supporting our work, and then also get unique stories about, how people got into firearms or got interested in firearms journalism and analysis. So why don't we start there? What was your particular journey, I guess, into the gun ownership world?
We can start, give or take 10 years ago. I was in a conversation with a friend of mine at work, and he mentioned, I have a gun. I'm like, and my thought was like, why would anybody need a gun? Why? And okay, fine. We put a pin in that. That was 10 years ago.
Pretty common reaction, I think, for a lot of Americans. There's plenty of people who don't own guns and don't have a desire to do it until something maybe comes up and changes their mind, right?
Well, yeah. And, I'd never really needed or thought about it even. So I was like, okay, no problem. And then, give or take 7 years ago, my buddy a different friend was like, hey, Brad, we've got to go to the range and go shooting. I'm like, I don't know. That's not really my thing. But I told him, I was like, you know what you could do is show me how to safely disarm a pistol. I didn't know that. I had no idea, but I was like, well, if that could be, something useful. So he's like, no problem. Come on over. So the next time I was over at his house, he field stripped his Beretta 92 FS, put all the pieces in front of me. I looked at them, put them back together, showed me the process of disarming it and, popping the, just you rack the slide, or you drop the magazine, rack the slide. And I was just looking at him like, that's it? He's like, yeah, that's it. And, at that point I was like, there's no mystery. There's no mystique. It's just a mechanical device. And I was like, I could learn to use this if I wanted to. And, so that thought starts percolating in my head for a little bit. And, a little while later, I was like, it's time to take that plunge. And, I bought my first pistol, and from that point forward, I've been very much enjoying learning how to use it properly. I've taken a number of defensive pistol classes. I try to keep my ear to the ground in terms of podcasts and reading books and stuff like that. So it's been a fun journey, and it struck me that it wasn't an instant the light turned on moment. It was, for me, it was a slow, there was a rocker switch and somebody's slowly turning on that bulb, and but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I mean, it was a good journey, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, right? And I think if you go back, if people listen to some of the member segments we've had since we've been doing the podcast, you'll get a wide variety, right, of how people came to be gun owners. You had people who were born into families that had guns, and they were always around guns growing up, and that's how they learned an appreciation for it. You have people who, when 2020 happened, the pandemic came on, the riots happened in the summer. There was all of the chaos that happened that year.
Yeah, busy year.
It was a heck of a year, that's for sure. But that drove a lot of people to consider buying a gun for the first time and then go out and do it. And we've had people on the show who've fallen into that camp. And then I think there's people like you, and really your story is fairly similar to mine in some ways, because I didn't grow up around firearms necessarily. We didn't. I think my mom had a little .22 rifle, but I never shot it. We had friends who had guns or hunted and so forth, but I wasn't into guns until later in life, after college, and it really was a sort of slow build up for me as well. I was afraid of firearms. I think growing up, not in the sense that if someone was going to shoot me. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, right, a low crime area, and so it wasn't that kind of concern. But there was the recoil, right? It's fear of recoil. I don't know if you had that at all, but it was something that bothered me for a long time until I shot a gun. And my first gun that I shot was a 12 gauge shotgun, which is not really what you would.
You're going from 0 to 100 on that one.
Yeah, it's not really what you would give to a beginner, but it didn't actually hurt, especially if you taught to hold it properly and shoot it properly. And we were shooting skeet at a cabin, and it was fun because I hit the skeet, and it, the skeet disintegrates, the clay pigeons go away, and it's exhilarating experience. It's a lot of fun. And then I slowly got into guns from there. I bought. And I didn't know much, and I didn't have friends that were really into guns either. So it was a relatively long learning process from that point. But it kind of snowballed.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, though, I got lucky. I fell in with a number of people that knew what they were doing, and were very willing to show me the right ways of doing things. I had some private lessons right off the bat, and I have a number of really good resources, at least in my opinion, in terms of local businesses and where I've taken classes. So it's important. Yeah. It is. You really can't ever forget what it is you're holding in your hands there. Mm-hmm. And you got to do it right.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a much better way to get into it, I think, than me, which was just like feeling it out. Taking some classes, of course, but I didn't have friends who were super into guns or anything at that moment in time when I first started doing it. And so, of course, a lot of mine also came from, as like a journalistic pursuit, right? Like I started doing more stories about guns as I became more interested in them personally.
Yep.
And so, I got to do a lot of firearm. I got to have a lot of experience with firearms through my work. So it was, that's probably pretty different from most people, I guess, and how they would come up. It's harder to see that happening for me because I didn't have a lot of the friends who were gun enthusiasts, and instead I got into it through work. So I don't know how much I would have gone down the rabbit hole, so to speak, if I hadn't made friends later on who were more interested in firearms. So it's certainly an interesting experience. But so tell me a little bit more about what your journey's been like since you got that first gun, 10 years ago. Do you have you gotten a concealed carry license? You said you've taken some classes. After that first gun, where did it lead?
Well, you got to learn how to use it, and the right places in classes. And actually, the very first class I took was with a friend who owns a range, and it's actually in the back of a semi trailer. And it was great because it was a private range, it's not very big, and it was great for conversation. It was great for, just basic learning to aim, point, shoot, do, just to get you on the map. And then, there's a number of ranges, locally. I took, because now I've been bit by the bug, once you're there, I was like, I need to know more. And so, I've taken 5 defensive pistol classes. There's I took a night shoot pistol class, which was really, really telling, how to use flashlights and everything.
Important, often overlooked too.
You know what? What blew me away was just how much the smoke obscures the flashlight. Like you just can't see for just a few moments after a shot. It was, I never would have thought of that if I hadn't actually experienced it myself. And then I've participated a number of times there's a defensive pistol league that we do, and our instructor sets up 3 different scenarios each time we go, which he's a cunning bastard, that guy. He's really clever with some of the things that he sets up, and I love it because it's very, it teaches you a lot about how you might react and about the way you perceive situations. And as far as the concealed carry, yes, I have that. I've had that for 5, 6, 7 years now. And am I carrying? I'm wading into it. I have carried before, and it's something that for the longest time I was just reading and learning about it. I do things in baby steps, and you got to be comfortable with where you're at, and then add another piece to that puzzle. And I'm learning to carry. I think probably in some ways, your ongoing saga is fun to listen to, but I'm figuring out where on my person the best place is, and adjusting cant and stuff like that.
I think that's something that's super common too, right? Is a lot of people will end up with a drawer full of old holsters because they didn't work out quite the way they expected them to. Yeah, it's one of the parts of carrying that is more difficult. It's like, how is this actually going to work for me? There's good resources out there. Active Self-Protection, I do their podcast, but they also have fantastic resources on carrying guns, and also on actual self-defense encounters, of course, too. But there's some things that exist out there to give you some very basic rules on what kind of holster you should go with. But beyond that, there's so many options, and you got to really zero in for your personal setup.
I think you're right. Yeah, you gotta just try stuff and see what works.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty interesting. So you've really, in that 10 years or so, come a long way from thinking, why would anyone ever need a gun, to now potentially carrying a gun on yourself. And I think that's not an uncommon journey either, right? I mean, I don't think you're alone in that.
No. Well, and to be frank, I especially like introducing other people now, because I like them to get bitten by the bug, so to speak. If anybody I know, is interested and they come ask me some gun questions, I'm like, you know what? Let's just go to the range, or, like I'll go over to their house and do the same thing that was done for me, take apart, and just safely show them the hardware. so that they know what it is to hold it. And then, we'll make a time and go to the range. And it's a lot of fun. Just like the guys from Open Source Defense, they're always like, take a newbie shooting.
Yeah.
Those, really, I love those guys because they make a lot of really good points in all of their writings. But I agree with take a newbie shooting. Take somebody, introduce somebody to the activity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of writing, what was it that got you into the Reload?
You know what? Well, you mentioned the Active Self-Protection podcast earlier because I kind of picked up on both of those at the same time. I'm like, hey, that's the same guy. It's over here. So I was like, all right. And I found you do a really good job of picking your words. You do a really good job. This is my opinion. But I think you do a really good job at the Reload of as you say, sane, sober, it's balanced. It's not, I hate spin, and I don't get that from you. The Reload is very much, in my opinion, a really, it's good information. It's just plain old good information and the analysis. Here's what happened. Here's what to think of. Here's what, not what to think of it, but here's how we digest it. Right. And that's worth its weight in gold to me.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean that's the line we try to draw, right? Like we try. Most publications will have an opinion section that'll tell you what they think you should think about something or how things ought to be. But we try to stick with analysis, right? Because we want to report the news, break the news, hopefully as often as we possibly can, get stories out there that wouldn't otherwise get coverage, but then also give you, the realistic take of what this means or what it could mean or the implications for it without trying to beat you over the head with our political opinions, which, everyone has them. We have them too. I have them. But I find it's more valuable to give people an honest appraisal of what's going on rather than what's happening rather than what I think should happen. What I mean?
Yeah. So, well, that comes through loud and clear.
It's always very encouraging when I hear that from members because that's exactly what we're trying to do. And I'm hopeful that there's a large audience that's looking for that kind of work, whether they're people who own guns or people who don't own guns. I mean, anyone who's just interested in where this issue is at and where it's headed. I hope we can be a resource for anyone in that group, whatever your political beliefs might be. But yeah, look, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story with us and giving us a little bit of insight into who you are and who our membership is here at the Reload. And if anyone else wants to become a member, they can go over to our website and look at our membership options. We got yearly memberships and monthly memberships. The yearly is a little bit better of a deal. You get sort of 2 months for free with that one, but it literally is what keeps us going. That is how we fund our reporting. That is how we pay myself and anyone else who's writing for the Reload or doing work for us. So it's extremely valuable, but also at the same time, I believe that we're offering members exclusive content that is actually valuable and worth the money that you're paying. So it's not just to support us, though it does support us. You also get value out of it. And of course, you'll get access to this podcast a day earlier. And of course, the opportunity to appear on the show, just like this segment here with Brad. So if you're interested in that, head on over and check out our memberships. And if you're not at that point yet where you want to buy a membership, you can also help us by sharing this podcast, rating it on wherever you're listening to it, leaving a comment on YouTube, anything like that will help us. So please feel free to do so if you can. But that's all we've got for this week. We will be back again with you real soon.